Welcome to Voice of Stories. Discover tales that inspire, captivate, and bring words to life. Subscribe for unforgettable stories.
In a small town in Ohio, there was a house that always seemed too quiet. Inside, a little girl named Sophie lived, carrying secrets too heavy for an 8-year-old to bear. One night, a desperate whisper into a phone would set off a chain of events no one in the town could have imagined. But would her cry for help be enough, or would it disappear into the silence? If you're ready to uncover the mysteries hidden within these walls, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single twist. It was almost midnight when the house stood still, cloaked in darkness. Sophie sat on the cold floor of the basement, clutching a small, outdated phone she had managed to sneak past her father, Brian. Her little hands trembled as she dialed the numbers her late mother had once taught her, back when life had been filled with warmth, bedtime stories, and laughter, instead of silence and fear. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Sophie hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Please help me, she murmured. My dad, he hurts me. My stomach really hurts. Please. She didn't get to finish. Heavy footsteps echoed from upstairs, growing louder as they approached. Panic surged through her as she dropped the phone and tried to hide it under her shirt. The basement door creaked open, and there stood Brian, a tall, imposing man whose shadow seemed to swallow the room. Sophie, he said, his voice dangerously calm. What are you doing down here? Before she could answer, his eyes landed on the faint glow of the phone screen. His face twisted with rage. Who told you to touch that? He barked, snatching the phone from her. Sophie cowered, trembling, her small frame shrinking in fear. Brian glared at the phone for a moment, then smashed it against the wall with a single brutal swing. You think someone's going to save you? He hissed. No one's coming. No one cares. Upstairs, Emily, Sophie's stepmother, sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of cold coffee. She heard the commotion but didn't move. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the mug. Emily wasn't cruel, not intentionally, but she'd long convinced herself that keeping quiet was the safest option. Minutes later, the shrill wail of police sirens broke through the night. Sophie's heart leapt with hope, but Brian didn't flinch. He straightened his shirt and walked upstairs, leaving Sophie alone in the dark. When the officers knocked, Brian opened the door with a practiced smile. Good evening, officers, he said smoothly. Is there a problem? We received a call from this address, one of the officers said, glancing past Brian into the house. A little girl reported she was in danger. Brian chuckled softly. Oh, that must have been Sophie. She's always playing with the phone, pretending to be a superhero or a detective. Kids these days, you know? Come on in, I'll show you. Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale. She forced a smile and gestured toward the living room. She's fine, Emily said flatly. The officers followed them inside, where Sophie sat on the couch, her head bowed. One of the officers knelt down in front of her. Hi, sweetheart, did you call us? He asked gently. Sophie looked up, her big, tear-filled eyes meeting his. Before she could speak, Brian's voice cut in. She gets scared sometimes, especially after her mom passed, he said, placing a heavy hand on Sophie's shoulder. We're doing our best to help her feel safe again. Sophie's chest tightened as she felt the weight of his hand. Her eyes darted to Emily, silently pleading for her to say something, but Emily looked away. The officers exchanged a glance, then stood up. Well, if everything's okay here, we'll head out. But call us if you need anything. Brian walked them to the door, thanking them for their time as the red and blue lights disappeared down the street. He turned back to Sophie. Go to your room, he ordered. Sophie didn't move at first, frozen in place. I said go to your room, he shouted, making her jump. She scrambled off the couch and hurried upstairs, her heart pounding. Emily started to speak, her voice hesitant. Brian, maybe we should... Not another word, Emily, he snapped. You want to end up like Maria? Keep pushing me. Emily's face drained of color and she lowered her gaze, saying nothing more. Upstairs, Sophie sat on her bed, clutching a stuffed rabbit her mother had given her. She didn't remember much about Maria, just the scent of lavender and the sound of a lullaby. But she missed her fiercely. From her window, she could see the faint glow of a neighbor's porch light. It was Margaretha's house. The older woman had always been kind, waving to Sophie whenever she played in the yard. But Brian had warned her to stay away, calling Margaretha a nosy old bat. Sophie glanced at the broken shards of the phone Brian had thrown into the trash. She had tried, but it wasn't enough. As the night grew colder, Sophie's mind wandered to the stories her mother used to tell her, the ones about brave girls who faced monsters and won. "I have to be brave," Sophie whispered to herself. She didn't know how, but she vowed that she would find a way out. The next morning, Sophie tiptoed downstairs, hoping to avoid Brian. She found Emily at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced circles on the mug with her finger. "Where's Dad?" Sophie asked cautiously. Emily looked up, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "He left early," she said softly. "He won't be back until late." Sophie exhaled, relief washing over her. "Why don't you eat something?" Emily suggested, standing up and opening the cupboard. Sophie hesitated, but her hunger outweighed her apprehension. She reached for a slice of toast, nibbling on it quietly. Emily sat back down, watching her with an expression Sophie couldn't quite read. The day stretched on uneventfully, until Sophie decided to venture into the basement. It was a place she hated, dark, damp, and filled with shadows, but something about it called to her. It felt like the heart of the house's secrets, a place where the truth might be hidden. She descended the creaky stairs, each step echoing in the stillness. Old boxes were stacked against the walls, covered in a thick layer of dust. Most of them were labeled in Brian's sharp handwriting: tools, winter clothes, miscellaneous. As she rummaged through a box labeled old papers, something caught her eye. A small wooden jewelry box tucked beneath a stack of faded receipts. It was locked, but the hinges were loose. With a bit of effort, Sophie pried it open. Inside were letters, yellowed with age. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the top of the first page made her breath catch. "Dear Emily," the letter began. Sophie's hands shook as she read the words. The letter was from a woman named Maria, her real mother. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't leave. He'd never let me. But I need you to know. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Brian, he's not who you think he is. Please take care of Sophie. Don't let her grow up in fear." The letter ended abruptly, as if Maria hadn't had time to finish. Sophie stared at the words, her heart pounding. She had so many questions, but one thing was clear. Emily knew more than she had ever let on. Sophie climbed the stairs slowly, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She found Emily in the living room, folding laundry. "Mom?" Sophie said quietly, holding out the letter. Emily froze when she saw it. Her face went pale as she snatched the letter from Sophie's hand. "Where did you find this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "In the basement," Sophie admitted. "Why didn't you tell me about her? About Maria?" Emily's expression softened, but her voice trembled. "I was trying to protect you," she said. "Your mother, she was a good woman. She loved you so much. But Brian, he—" Emily stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "What did he do?" Sophie pressed. Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't talk about it." Sophie felt a surge of anger. "You always say that," she shouted. "You say you'll protect me, but you don't do anything. You just let him hurt us." Emily flinched as if Sophie had slapped her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this." Sophie stormed out of the room, clutching the letter. If Emily wouldn't help her, Sophie realized she would have to figure things out on her own. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Maria had tried to warn Emily. She had known what Brian was capable of. And now, Sophie was living in the nightmare her mother had feared. Sophie made a decision. She couldn't rely on Emily anymore. If she wanted to uncover the truth and escape, she would have to be brave.